You would think that if there was any odd pairing, that this would be the odd pairing to pair up Christians with this sci-fi franchise created by a man who was self-consciously trying to seek a perfect world that's perfect because it's got rid of God and religion, since religion has caused the vast majority of humanity's problems. Needless to say, we would think ardent and obsessive Christians would be the least likely to be any kind of big fans of that kind of sci-fi TV show. However, it seems that the opposite has startlingly often come to be the case, at least on an anecdotal level. So let me go ahead and share some all these various bits of my anecdotal perspective here, and then I'm going to suggest some reasons why this might be the case. So, for myself, I grew up in a pretty conservative, traditional Christian homeschool family in the 90s and early 2000s. So, way back when homeschooling was not a thing yet. So for me, growing up in the 2000s, that means that I was an 8 to 14-year-old at the height of the social unacceptability of Star Trek in mainstream culture. So think 1999 to 2005, because I was born in 91. And then for myself, as one of my many badges of embarrassing nerd cred, because this is back when being a nerd was not a good thing, but one of my many embarrassing badges was the fact that one of the very few television shows that our family watched when we didn't watch TV for the most part, but we watched Star Trek. So whenever one of my friends asked what we watched, my answer had to be, well, we don't really watch TV. We just watch Bonanza and Star Trek. And so some people might ask which Star Trek, and the answer was any Star Trek, all Star Trek, any Star Trek we can get our hands on. Well, that sounds very normal, doesn't it? Now you would think that this odd thing here would be a kind of one-off anomaly, that there'd be more or less nobody else like that. That we would be pretty close to being the only ones who have that really quirky, odd pairing of passionate Christianity that's so passionate that it looks really weird, paired with this passionate Trekdom that is so passionate that it looks kind of weird. Because after all, within popular culture at that time, Star Trek was certainly not a legit option for you to be a fan of. And so how much more would it be not a thing for Christians? But in fact, it turns out this wasn't really the case. I remember discovering to my surprise when I was 10 or 11, something like that. I remember sitting around the campfire on a church canoe trip and then discovering to my surprise that the pastor of our church, this really small King James only independent fundamental Baptist church, that the pastor is a highly enthusiastic Star Trek fan. He just hadn't talked about it till that point, as he's around the campfire, just suddenly talking to everybody going on about Star Trek transporters. I also remember I had a friend around that time in our tiny little church there. I had a friend who I discovered, to my surprise, that his whole family was enthusiastic Star Trek fans. They lived on a farm and they owned the entire original series of Star Trek on VHS. They were still in the process at that point. They're still in the process of collecting Next Generation episodes. But you see, they were so conservative of Christians that they didn't believe in having TV at their house in the sense of live TV with an antenna. Yet, they had collected the entire original series of Star Trek, and they were slowly starting to collect Next Generation episodes, or as my 10-year-old friend called it, the new ones. That's what they called the Next Generation, the new ones. I'm like, what do you mean the new ones? At the time, I was watching Voyager reruns every evening at 7 p.m. with my family. So I was quite confused to hear him use the phrase the new ones to refer to the second oldest show in the franchise. Now, what's interesting since then is that over the years, I have found this startlingly consistent pattern of pastors and other religious professionals turning out to be enthusiastic, dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore Star Trek fans. I remember visiting this tiny little King James only Baptist church when I was 19 or 20 and finding in their basement, they literally had a giant hand-painted USS Enterprise D, in case you were wondering, it was the D. But this giant hand-painted Enterprise covering the entire back wall of their church's basement. Turns out the lead pastor there was a Trekkie. What the? So what in the heck is up with all these Christians and so many pastors of all things being disproportionately crazy over Star Trek? Star Trek, the Roddenberry show. Roddenberry, the guy who envisions a future where humanity is saved largely by giving up religion, giving up Christianity in particular. Well, I found myself reflecting on that question a little more in the last couple of years here. But the more I reflect on the question, I actually start to think, I start to find answers that may actually not be quite as complicated or unusual as you might expect. So there are several fairly big, pretty sensible reasons that I think Christians have always, it seems, been a sizable part of the Star Trek fan community, at least the armchair fan community. So I can't comment on whether these are the kinds of fans who collect the action figures and go to the conventions and that kind of thing, because I'm not privy to that world. I haven't been to a convention, but I'm talking particularly about that group of people who faithfully watch, who the people who obsessively think about, who exuberantly love and love it when others talk about and think about Star Trek. So let's rewind back to classic Star Trek. Let's start there. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of the kinds of fans that I mentioned above, usually it seems they tended to think of, because this was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, they tended to think of Star Trek as being either the show about Kirk and his friends or the show about Picard and his friends. So TOS and TNG. Back then, it wasn't just these Christian people, but in general, the Trek community, I think at that point, Star Trek meant TOS and TNG. Everything else was a spinoff. So if we go back to 1970, 1980, or 1995, uh, what would a conservative Christian pastor or a theology student, let's say, or otherwise an enthusiastic Christian, what would one of those people see if you flicked on the TV, because this is back when we had TV, we didn't have streaming. But if you took his remote, or maybe he had a really old TV. When I grew up, we had one really old TV in the back room that was so old that you didn't have a remote. You just flicked on the volume control, and that's how you turned on the TV. But anyway, let's say it's a remote, and let's say this is 1995 or 1980, whatever. Flicks on the TV and happens to see an episode of this show, which is called Star Trek, and he's not familiar with it yet. So, primarily, I suppose he would see a pleasant sci-fi show with some intelligent themes being discussed. What would those themes be? Well, often questions about what is right and what is wrong, how humans can do and be just a little bit better. In fact, a pastor might watch an episode of TOS, let's say, and find that that episode that he happened to see was through the medium of story was kind of doing the same thing that that pastor himself might be trying to do every Sunday morning, particularly moral formation. So challenging the audience or the congregation in the case of the church, challenging them to explore what is right and wrong, what they believe to be right or wrong, challenging them to ask themselves what they would do in that situation, what they have been doing, and what they would like to be doing, what they feel they morally ought to begin to or continue to do and be. In other words, what their ideals and their values and everything ought to be, what they want to become. And so Star Trek has always done something that is relatively uncommon, not entirely absent, but relatively uncommon in mainstream television programming, and that is engaging its viewers with moral questions and preaching without being preachy, or usually without being preachy anyway. And like I said, it's not that no other television show does or did that kind of thing, but let's be honest, very few shows prioritize it in an intelligent way like Star Trek does. Now, interestingly, according to Wikipedia, now I haven't checked the sources here, so I suppose Wikipedia treat it like it's a rumor, but according to Wikipedia, Wikipedia says that shortly before his Star Trek days, Gene Roddenberry ended up receiving an award from some group connected to the Northern Baptist Convention, or as it would have been called at the time, American Baptist Churches USA. But he received an award from some group connected to them for being so extraordinarily good at teaching Christian principles, that's how it was phrased, through television and film. Now, the fact that he was offered the award doesn't mean he was interested in accepting it. And also keep in mind that the Northern Baptist Convention, or the American Baptist Churches USA, as it was renamed in the 70s, Keep in mind that that was a group that was usually considered theologically liberal, meaning being associated with the kinds of movements in Christianity that wanted to preserve the traditional church experience while loosening or letting go of the key supernatural claims of the Bible. So, by some definitions, you might not consider that group all that Christian, but still, this is a whole group of people who apparently thought that Roddenberry was exceptionally good at preaching Christian principles through story, even though Roddenberry was already at that point a very hardcore atheist. Presumably, that must have been before he made it so clear that he believes the solution to all of human ills is eliminating religion, including Northern Baptists. But but anyway, so back to our picture here, you might say the first thing a pastor might see when he flicks on or clicks on the TV there might be how well Star Trek is doing what he's been trying to do every Sunday. And many Star Trek episodes basically being a great big giant sermon illustration that makes several points and doubles back around on the illustration to leave you walking away from the TV pondering this moral point or this philosophical point from all kinds of angles, leaving you musing and examining while you walk away what it really would mean for you to do and be just a little bit better today than you were yesterday. And the next thing he might notice if he kept watching Star Trek might be how philosophical and pondering and intellectually exploratory it tended to be. Because Star Trek has always been the franchise of thinkers, armchair philosophers, that kind of thing. And for most pastors, that would be, I think, a pretty big perk. After all, pastors kind of get paid to think and read and speak about the big questions of life, things like death, meaning, ethics, friendship, the nature of existence, the soul or lack of a soul, etc. And while the pastor may likely, especially if he's conservative, may find himself disagreeing with many of the philosophical conclusions, yet the fact is that most television isn't even bringing these things up. So in that sense, it would be kind of like getting to chat with a fellow student who happens to have some different ideas, but he's always challenging you, giving you new categories to think about that you may not have bumped into. And then this would be bumped up several levels even more if we're talking about more of a sophisticated seminary trained kind of pastor, because the field of professional theology has a huge overlap with the professional discipline of philosophy. And anyone who's interested in studying theology at the graduate level or beyond the graduate level is definitely going to be absolutely fascinated with the kind of philosophical and intellectual discussions and thematic explorations within a franchise like classic Star Trek. So that was the second thing. Then the third and fourth things that this hypothetical pastor in the 70s, 80s, or 90s might see might be probably, let's say, number three, the utopian optimism and hopefulness of Star Trek, which is often considered by fans to be the true message or the true core message of the franchise, sometimes referred to as the Roddenberry vision. So that number three, or number four, all the anti-religion episodes in which Kirk, for example, debunks some toxic religion on some planet somewhere and frees those poor aliens from their faithful fellowship chains so that they can become good, happy humanists forever after. So you might think, wouldn't these number three and number four items, wouldn't these be a giant big turnoff to make him want to flick off the TV and never come back? Especially if he's one of the King James only fundamentalist types, like I mentioned at the beginning there. Well, it's an interesting thing about Roddenberry's vision. It's a very hopeful picture. Everything that happens, which may look bad, is ultimately believed to be moving toward a beautiful, wonderful final goal, this destiny of hope. And along the way, the crew aims to embody that ultimate vision, almost kind of like they are embodying this precursor of the final good that awaits the galaxy on a larger scale in the further future. They are embodying that in the present of the show, which is our future. That whole picture kind of ends up feeling kind of familiar to some Christians because you could say it's the good news of Star Trek, kind of like Christians teach the good news of Jesus. So even though this hypothetical pastor, he's going to disagree about how we get to that great hope of future, this destiny to come, but he might feel kind of at home with this ethos of this peace and harmony and joy of this great hopeful, we could say this Church of the Enterprise under Pastor Jim Kirk, who preaches to all the aliens that they can start living in the new way of the future because the new day is coming, but it hasn't come yet, but it can come today with us. Just, cancel out all the God words that I just put in there, like church and all this stuff, which, of course, would be very offensive to somebody like Roddenberry or very offensive to the true classic Trek perspective. But in a way, it's kind of like this aspect of the Roddenberry vision is the kind of thing that would make the hypothetical pastors like the real ones that I mentioned could possibly make some of them watch through and kind of think and feel to themselves, yeah, man, I don't agree with this Star Trek, but man, every episode, it's almost like I forget that I don't agree with it because it feels so much like Christianity. And then that kind of makes sense also when you consider the fact that Roddenberry himself actually grew up Southern Baptist. And then he left that very early on for atheism, or particularly, we could say, he really left it for secular humanism, which historically speaking, we could think of as a post-Christian movement specifically, and which many Christians would argue largely amounts to secular humanism, largely amounts to, many Christians would argue, largely amounts to a modified Christianity, focusing on morality and hopefulness, basically Christianity minus all the embarrassing bits. So kind of like theologically liberal Christianity taken several steps further and then getting rid of the baggage of actual, like the traditional church, let's go to church on Sunday kind of stuff. But particularly when it comes to the approach to morality, Star Trek episodes focusing on moral kinds of themes do often come off sounding kind of Christian, or at least as long as they don't start talking about sex. Okay, so now what about that fourth thing I mentioned? As I mentioned, numbers 3 and 4 would be the ones where we'd expect the Christian pastor to, go for a hike and never turn it on again. But so what about that fourth one? Roddenberry was quite focused on making episodes that explicitly attack through the symbolism and the thinking that they push toward making explicit, or I suppose we'd say implicit, but explicitly intended, but implicitly kind of, subtly attacking Christianity. So you might think, wouldn't that right there really diminish the number of Christians who watch the show? Well, surprisingly, I don't think that's what happened. And I've heard other people say this kind of thing because it seems like, by now most of us know about Roddenberry, what he believed, what he was kind of pushing and stuff like that. But the funny thing is, it seems that he had such violently negative views of religion that the kinds of religion he portrayed in Star Trek to make indirect attacks against Christianity and against religion in general, it ended up sounding so different from anything that many Christians recognized that a lot of the time, I think, they didn't realize that he was attacking them. Because what they would have noticed a lot of the time would have just been Kirk debunking some really offensive false gods, which is something they want to do as well. In the case of many pastors, that's something they see as a large part of their job as pastors, to save people from being deceived by false religion. And the religion in the original Star Trek tends to be highly toxic cults with really visibly destructive and false, demonstrably false beliefs and practices, with poor epistemology, with a destructively authoritarian power structure that forbids the asking of questions, etc. Now, some of that could be partly because Roddenberry was being careful not to be so on the nose that he would anger the censors. After all, there's the famous story of the one episode where Kirk has the line to the Apollo alien god. Kirk says, mankind has no need for gods. The one is quite enough for us. And they added the second part to be less offensive to the audience. Um, so there's stuff like that, and of course we know if you watch carefully, it doesn't take long to realize the Enterprise crew members never talk about God. The heroes never talk about God or do or say anything religious. Even their weddings take place without any kind of religious aspect. But that said, if you're just sitting down and you're just watching this fun show, and it doesn't occur to you that Roddenberry is attacking you, then it doesn't occur to you that he's attacking you. And you might think that Roddenberry is actually just doing something kind of like what Tolkien did in The Lord of the Rings, where there's this assumed religious stuff underneath, but we don't want to put it out there and and have people dislike it for that reason. Ironically, remember that friend I mentioned whose whole family watched Star Trek and they lived on a farm and they watched Star Trek even though they had a religious conviction against television, if it's live television? Well, anyway, get this. My friend was told that we shouldn't watch Deep Space Nine because DS9 has false gods on it. So, for that kind of Christian, they thought that the anti-religious Roddenberry bits in TOS were quote unquote good, true Christian, because it was debunking false gods, just like Daniel and Paul and Jeremiah in the Bible. But from their point of view, the stories in Deep Space Nine, which, as far as I'm concerned, are usually using the Bajoran prophets as a fairly transparent, symbolic, almost an allegory for the Judeo-Christian God. But anyway, to these particular Christians, that's what they find offensive because this is a false God. It's not the true God. They'd rather stick with the old Roddenberry vision where we just debunk every religion we come across because that feels safer. That's good for Christians. This other stuff, that's not good. It's false. Well, the irony there is rich. Actually, in my college days, I remember I kept my Star Trek to myself, but around the time Star Trek 2009 came out, people made passing comments. And I remember this one particular roommate who mentioned that when he was a kid, he watched Star Trek. And Kirk and Picard are okay to watch as a Christian, but Deep Space Nine is bad. Don't watch it. You're not allowed. For the same reason my friend as a kid had mentioned. Of course, by the time I heard it when I was in college from this other friend who was a slightly different kind of Christian than me, by that time I had enough understanding of the storytelling style of Star Trek that when he made that comment, and I think he still believed it, it just made me really angry. Though at that point for me it wouldn't be until about 6 or 7 years later that I would go back and watch DS9 as an adult and be startlingly blown away by the depth and pro-Christian tone of the religious themes throughout that series. But even at this point where my friend told me that I already, just from my watching it as a teenager, could tell that's not a fair way to read the series. Anyway, so that's why I think Christians and especially pastors really have, and my evidence is just anecdotal. I don't have any kind of like surveys or anything, but it seems to me, and then this is why I think it would be the case, what I think the explanation would be for why Christians and especially pastors really may have tended to gravitate towards Star Trek over the years, over the decades, and often ended up becoming some of the most enthusiastic Star Trek fans. Roddenberry was trying to do with Star Trek something very similar to what a good pastor, what a skilled pastor is trying to do, which is to encourage thought and reflection and moral formation, and to do this while proclaiming a resounding, hopeful message of good news, which he hopes will open the eyes of the viewer and enable them to take the next step with the knowledge that there is something beautiful to come. There is a fix for what is bad around us, and that fix gets to be previewed, pre-lived among the faithful who know that good news and who live for that good news, i.e., by Starfleet, the crew of the Enterprise, etc. And this is the same reason I think that in that one DS9 episode, I think it's called The Ship, but there's that one episode where they're on the planet and Sisko is talking to the Vorta, who asks him if he has any gods. And Sisko answers, "There are things I believe in: Starfleet, the Federation." I think that the reason Christians and particularly pastors feel so at home watching Star Trek is because Starfleet and the Federation are so much like the kind of Christianity that some of those pastors believe in. Because the crew of the Enterprise is so much like the kind of church that they want to build. Because the good news of the hope of Star Trek gives the same warm feelings and moral passion and drive to become better, which they want the good news of their faith to give for those they spread it to. So, I don't know if I convinced you. Maybe now you're going to go start looking up some stats. But at the end of the day, I think, for myself at least, I tend to think that Christians will always form a particularly enthusiastic part of the audience of Star Trek and of that group of people who love and listen to and passionately reflect upon Star Trek stories. And regardless of the fact that, particularly the more conservative Christians will certainly find themselves disagreeing with many key areas where the humanism of Star Trek departs fairly radically from their conservative Christian view of things, and yet they continue to be a part of that audience. And I guess that's partly because perhaps perhaps humanists and Christians have more in common than we usually take the time to notice.